Have you ever noticed that some people, when they get hurt, don't yell, they don't cry, they don't even tell you what's wrong, they just go quiet? And somehow, that silence feels louder than any argument could ever be. It's strange when you think about it. We're taught that pain is supposed to be loud. Movies show heartbreak as screaming, crying, slamming doors. But in real life, some of the deepest pain looks like nothing at all. Just stillness. A person sitting across from you, physically present, emotionally gone. If you've ever watched someone you love shut down like that, you probably felt helpless. You probably wondered, what did I do? And if you're someone who does this yourself, you've probably wondered why you can't just say what's wrong, even when you desperately want to. Here's what's interesting. This isn't stubbornness. It isn't manipulation either, even though it can feel that way to the person on the other side. What's actually happening is something much older than the argument you're having. Something your body learned long before you had the words to understand it. Let's start with what silence actually is, underneath the surface. When we think of emotional reactions, we usually think of fight or flight. Your heart races, your muscles tense, you either push back or you run. But there's a third response that gets almost no attention, and it might be the most misunderstood reaction a human being can have. It's called the freeze response. Freeze isn't the absence of a reaction. It's a full reaction, just one that doesn't look like one. Your nervous system, when it senses a threat too big to fight and too inescapable to flee, does something almost primal. It shuts the system down. Voice goes quiet. Expression goes flat. Words, which normally come so easily, suddenly feel impossible to find. Think about it like a circuit breaker. When there's too much electrical current running through a system, the breaker trips, not because something is broken, but because it's protecting the whole system from damage. That's what's happening inside someone who goes silent when they're hurt. Their brain has essentially tripped a breaker to prevent something from short-circuiting. Now here's where it gets even stranger. This isn't a conscious decision. Nobody wakes up and decides, today when I'm hurt, I will say nothing. This response is wired in far below conscious thought, in a part of the brain that doesn't use language at all. Deep in the brain, there's a small almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. It's constantly scanning the environment for danger, faster than your conscious mind can even process what's happening. When it senses emotional danger, it can override the parts of your brain responsible for speech and reasoning. This is why, in the middle of a painful moment, some people genuinely cannot find words. It isn't that they're choosing silence. It's that the very system responsible for producing language has been temporarily hijacked. Imagine trying to have a calm, articulate conversation while your brain is essentially screaming that something is unsafe. That's the internal experience for a lot of people who go quiet. On the outside, it looks like withdrawal. On the inside, it feels like drowning. But here's what nobody talks about. This response usually isn't random. It's learned. Think back to childhood for a moment. Imagine a child who expresses sadness, and instead of comfort, they're met with irritation. Or a child who cries and is told to stop being so sensitive. Or a child who speaks up about being hurt and is punished, ignored, or made to feel like a burden for having feelings at all. What does that child learn? Not consciously, but on a much deeper level. They learn that expressing pain is dangerous. That vulnerability leads to more pain, not less. And so, over time, the nervous system adapts. It stops sending signals outward. It starts protecting the person by keeping everything locked inside. This is where attachment psychology becomes fascinating. Researchers have long studied how early relationships with caregivers shape the way we handle emotional closeness and conflict as adults. People who developed what's often called an avoidant attachment style tend to have learned very early that emotional needs are safer left unspoken. Not because they don't have needs, but because expressing them once felt too risky. So when they get hurt as adults, the old pattern reactivates. Silence isn't cruelty. It's an old survival strategy, quietly running in the background, doing exactly what it was built to do. Now, here's the part that changes everything. While one person is going silent to protect themselves, the other person in the relationship is often experiencing the exact opposite reaction. They feel abandoned. They feel like the silence is punishment. And so they push. They ask questions. They demand answers. Which, ironically, makes the silent person shut down even further. It becomes a loop. One person needs space to process. The other person needs reassurance and words. And without either person realizing it, they're both acting out of fear, just expressing that fear in opposite directions. Psychologists studying relationship conflict have observed this pattern so often that it has its own name. Some call it the pursuer and withdrawer dynamic. The pursuer moves closer when things feel unstable. The withdrawer moves away. Both are trying to feel safe. Neither realizes they're doing the same dance from two different sides. Here's something even more unexpected. Silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it's overflowing. Have you noticed how, right before someone shuts down completely, there's often a moment where they seem almost too calm, almost unreadable? That calm can be misleading. Underneath it, the body is often working overtime. Heart rate can spike. Stress hormones like cortisol can surge. This state even has a name in psychological research, sometimes called emotional flooding, where a person becomes so overwhelmed internally that shutting down becomes the only way the nervous system can cope. It's like a pot boiling over, except instead of spilling outward, it seals the lid shut. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. From the inside, it can feel like everything is happening all at once. This is why, when someone finally does speak after going silent, they sometimes seem confused about their own feelings. Not because they didn't feel anything, but because so much was happening internally that it became difficult to separate one emotion from another. Now here's an unexpected twist that researchers have found fascinating. Silence, in some cases, isn't just about self-protection. It's about protecting the relationship itself. Some people go quiet, not because they don't care, but because they care too much. They're afraid that if they speak while they're hurt, they'll say something they can't take back. So instead of risking damage to something they value, they choose to say nothing until they feel steady enough to speak carefully. This is sometimes described as emotional self-regulation, a kind of internal pause button. And while it can look like avoidance from the outside, for some people, it's actually an attempt at protecting the relationship, even if it doesn't feel that way to the person waiting for a response. Of course, this isn't universal. For others, silence really is about distance, about creating separation because closeness itself feels unsafe. The tricky part is that from the outside, both versions of silence can look identical, which is exactly why they're so often misunderstood. Here's where it becomes even more personal. If you've ever been the one who goes quiet, you've probably felt guilty about it. You've probably watched someone plead for you to talk and felt an overwhelming inability to give them what they're asking for, even though you wanted to. That gap between wanting to speak and being able to speak is one of the loneliest experiences a person can have. And if you've ever been on the other side, waiting for someone to open up, you've probably felt an ache that's hard to describe. Not anger exactly. More like being locked out of someone you care about. Standing at a door you can't open no matter how gently you knock. Both experiences are valid. Both come from real pain. An understanding that can change everything about how these moments unfold. Here's what's especially interesting. Some researchers who study long-term relationships have found that the ability to tolerate silence without immediately interpreting it as rejection is one of the strongest predictors of emotional stability between two people. Not because silence is good, but because panic in response to silence often makes things worse while patience allows the nervous system time to reset. It's a strange kind of paradox. The very thing that feels like it needs fixing immediately is often the thing that heals fastest when it isn't rushed. Now here's a deeper layer to this. Silence isn't only about relationships with other people. It's often a mirror of someone's relationship with themselves. People who struggle to name their emotions in the moment sometimes experience a pattern researchers describe as difficulty identifying and articulating internal feelings. It isn't that the emotion isn't there. It's that the bridge between feeling something and describing it in words has never fully developed, often because it was never modeled or allowed growing up. Imagine trying to translate a language you were never taught to speak. That's what it can feel like for some people. In the exact moment, they're expected to explain how they feel. This is why healing this pattern isn't about forcing words to come faster. It's about slowly building a sense of safety until the nervous system no longer feels the need to protect itself through silence. And this is the perspective shift worth sitting with. Silence, in these moments, was never really about the other person. It was about survival. An old, deep protective pattern, doing exactly what it learned to do a long time ago in a completely different context with completely different stakes. Understanding that doesn't mean silence stops hurting to witness, but it changes what it means. It stops being rejection. It becomes a signal, a quiet message that says, something inside me needs safety before it can find words. And maybe that's the real truth hiding underneath all of this. The people who go silent when they're hurt aren't the ones who feel the least. Often they're the ones who learned long ago that feeling too much out loud wasn't safe. Which brings up an entirely different question, one just as important as this one. If silence is often a learned survival response, what about the people who do the opposite? The ones who over-explain, who apologize instantly, who fill every uncomfortable silence with words, even when nothing is truly wrong. That pattern comes from somewhere too, and understanding it might explain a completely different side of how humans learn to survive emotional pain.